As Law said, I'm Dr. Kayla Jones, and my talk today is entitled The Power of Podcasting, Audio Storytelling Beyond Entertainment. And I'm going to be talking a bit about the rise in popularity of audio storytelling, podcast studies as a growing field of research, and how podcasting can be a powerful tool to tell multi-layered informative narratives beyond the realm of entertainment and in nonfiction contexts, like in sectors such as education, heritage, and tourism. I have a PhD in Welsh history focused on digital storytelling and heritage, and a master's in professional writing focused in writing for tourism. And so for my PhD, I created a long form narrative podcast around the Penrhyn estate, which is located up here in Wales, called Podlediad Penrhyn, with the aim of telling multi-layered stories about the past, present, and future of the estate in a way that was entertaining, informative, and personal to online audiences. So through my research, I found that audio storytelling and podcasting has the potential to take educational facts and historical events and turn them into engaging, multi-layered narratives that connect with modern audiences in a more lasting way than, say, traditional media like guidebooks. So what's the big deal about podcasting? Why is it being used in educational spaces such as history and science? So research conducted by the Infinite Dial in 2022 found that 66% of people in the UK listen to audio content a week. There are more than 4 million podcasts worldwide. And just using the UK as an example, a report from Statista found that 19 million people people listen to podcasts in the UK. And this is up from around 8 million listeners from 2017. So podcast listening has increasingly risen through the last decade. So popular genres of podcasts include comedy, news, politics, education, history, science, and true crime. Perhaps the most impactful catalyst in the rise of podcasts is in the media's flexibility and accessibility, both in the producing of podcasts and in consuming them. So in the past, creating radio shows independently was costly and largely unattainable for the everyday person, as professional studios and equipment were needed to broadcast radio shows. But in recent years, producing podcasts has become accessible and affordable for many, and the growth in independently produced podcasts has meant that modern listeners are used to media covering an array of topics. So on the listening end, podcasts can now expand beyond what's called the driveway moment. So where radio shows were often cut short due to listeners' driving times coming to an end, computers getting closed down because of working hours, or a channel being changed on the TV because of group preferences. So the use of personal mobile devices in a myriad of spaces means that listeners can access audio content whenever they choose, and through a distraction-free medium that allows listeners to get absorbed in the listening while doing other tasks like driving, commuting, cleaning, and exercising. So this visual-free media, which now has listeners consuming hours of content continuously over weeks at a time, it can stand out among radio and audiobooks as this on-demand media, which producers have the freedom to create hours and hours of content, and it can be consumed virtually anytime, anywhere by listeners. As there's so many different genres of podcasts, people across sectors have gotten involved in making their own podcasts. You know, comedians, scientists, archaeologists, journalists, chefs, dog trainers, you name it. Some podcasts are produced under networks or brands, and some go completely independent. But for many, podcasts can be a very informal way and a less structured way of reaching an audience. Many podcasts can be far more laid back than news programs or documentaries, and many podcasts in academic spaces enjoy the freedoms of podcasting where they can create, produce, and disseminate their content without some of the limitations that come with conforming to maybe larger brand guidelines. So podcast studies has become an ever-growing field as researchers like myself explore the way podcast can be used in spaces like sciences and humanities. So one of the most popular types of podcasts is the narrative podcast, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today. This style of podcast is most popularized by the true crime genre, and it combines elements such as a narrator, plot points, immersive music, diegetic audio, and a multitude of voices. The language used in these types of podcasts are accessible for broad audiences, but the nature of their content is used to educate, inform, and bring awareness. So research has shown that audio storytelling is a really effective way of telling facts and information through nonfiction narratives in a way that appeals to audiences emotionally to where they remember kind of key details more than if they were told those details in a news-like manner. So where did the rise in nonfiction podcasts come from, and why is it so impactful outside of the entertainment industry? I think the answer to that comes from the most downloaded podcast, at least at the height of when podcasts were becoming really popular, which is Serial. Of course, the origins of audio storytelling is rooted in oral storytelling and eventually the radio. But this particular style of podcast became popular with NPR's This American Life, and then Serial and S-Town were two of the biggest. So Serial is kind of seen as a pivotal series in podcast research because of its unique format. It has a combination of community and expert interviews, archival material, recordings, and audio from video footage, and a much more inquisitive, subjective, and personal host than other media such as documentaries or news reporting. So Serial told a narrative over 12 episodes from the perspective of a single narrator about a true crime story. Its producer, Sarah Koenig, acted as an on-the-ground informant for her listeners, interviewing people involved in the case, mapping out the clues, forming and recreating scenarios from the case, and asking rhetorical questions in a conversational tone that made the podcast feel personal, engaging, and exciting. The popularity of the podcast skyrocketed when it premiered, and it swiftly became the most downloaded podcast worldwide with 68 million downloads. And so Serial is kind of this example of how a long-form storytelling podcast is being offered to an on-the-go, multitasking society while they are going about their day. So my own journey into researching narrative style podcasts for my PhD kind of began by accident. I had originally been looking at National Trust guidebooks, the way they were written for a tourism audience, and attempting to see if this was the best way for sites like Penryn to tell their overall story of their site. Many heritage sites, especially country houses, can struggle to tell multi-layered stories. And what I mean by that is telling stories connected with history that spans multiple time periods. Sometimes those connections are global with transatlantic slavery. They involve industrial history or history connected to vast landscapes. And so when I began my research on the Penryn estate, there was medieval, Victorian, and colonial history attached with Penryn. There were thousands of articles and artifacts in the archives to explore. There was evidence of thousands of people who had lived and worked on the Penryn estate through the years, beyond just the people who lived at Penryn Castle. And so there was all these different personal perspectives and experiences, even ones that stretched to Jamaica and the US. So there was a lot of elements and aspects of the story that I had to consider when I was trying to create a podcast. In in the past, in terms of media created that could be consumed both on-site and off-site by visitors, was primarily just the guidebook in museum and heritage site settings. So brief informational booklets that visitors could pick up and flip through if they liked, going through a house or a museum that would point out certain things. But more often than not, when those books are taken home, a lot of times they're used as kind of coffee table books in the future. And I found these guidebooks to have a lot of limitations. They were restricted by needing to be a short length, needing to be standardized with other guidebooks across the National Trust. They were very didactic in nature. They listed factoids of the estate rather than kind of a full story. And they minimized offsite aspects of the estate's history, such as its connection to transatlantic slavery and its connection to local Welsh culture, in favor of telling stories focused on aristocratic connections, art, and architectural history. So visitors to a country house are not always in a place that makes it simple for heritage sites to discuss narratives that occur offsite or beyond the walls. And heritage sites, the heritage site is so linked to its physical presence that often there needs to be special effort paid to tell narratives that impact the site without them having taken place at that exact location. So in the past, house museums have been criticized for limiting interpretation practices to one linear narrative. So either on a central character or on a specific time period, when often these sites are connected with an expanded narrative, which is not represented in its interpretation to audiences who are visiting. So there's been discourse around what are some of the ways of exploring these multi-layered narratives, and is there a way that it can be done where these interconnected stories of landed estates are presented as the multi-locational, multi-generational, and multi-cultural sites that they are to evolving, digitally connected audiences. So when I began researching guidebooks and looking at alternative media to tell these multi-layered stories, at first, true crime narrative podcasts were really on my radar. What did that have to do with what I was trying to achieve? But the more I dove into the landscape of podcast studies and found that this nonfiction narrative style podcast was being utilized in an array of multidisciplinary research, I began to look at the structure of these types of podcasts more heavily. So podcasts like Serial had this kind of layering with an investigative journalist taking listeners along a journey through several episodes of a story, weaving in interview clips from personal stories, and then calling on experts in fields connected with the investigation, and introducing artifacts and clues from the case, all while layering in music and sounds to make the experience immersive for listeners. So when I was looking for ways of telling Penryn's story, the narrative style podcasts that have been used in true crime really stuck out to me because of this layering. And for me, because of how important it was to tell Penryn's multi-layered history, it was important that the way that it was told was in a multi-layered format as well. So what are the layers of a long-form narrative podcast? So narrative podcasts are first and foremost focused on storytelling over multiple episodes, bringing listeners along on a journey. Next is an inquisitive, subjective narrator, sounds and music, and voice and multivocality. So the first layers of the narrative podcast I'm going to talk about is long form audio storytelling. So over these, multiple episodes. So as opposed to text or images, which are static, sound doesn't sit still in the same way. It's active and it moves. So when you press play on a podcast, sound is moving. It continues until you stop it. So this can give listeners a sense that time is passing and that the story that's being told is immediate. So unlike with the eyes reading text or looking at images, it's far harder to jump around in a narrative podcast and kind of cherry pick elements that you want to participate in. With the use of a narrator in the long form narrative podcast, listeners are able to build a connection with the narrator and establish trust in what they're saying. And when I was studying the guidebooks format, I found that they resembled newspaper or news websites, or in some cases, kind of like a textbook in the way that they could be consumed. So text boxes with tidbits of information and quick facts allowed viewers to graze topics with their eyes, to pick out key details, and then skip over the text that they weren't really interested in. And so in the case of the Penryn estate, this style of reading would not give the entire story of the estate, and sometimes wouldn't give context to the estate's history either. So by contrast, it's a lot harder to jump around in a narrative podcast and kind of cherry pick elements that you want to learn about. So this does create a relationship between the listener and the podcast that requires the same level of commitment similar to fiction narratives, where listeners must join the journey of the narrative podcast from start, stay through the middle, and then travel to the end to get the full story. So podcast researchers such as Eden Kincaid have found that presenting voice data as text is inadequate, and that while many researchers attempt to contextualize quotes from research participants in their written word, some scholars argue that text alone falls short in communicating what words actually signify. So the words that are written or said are not the only data to be communicated to the listener. Elements such as a voice's tone, intonation, and emotion are not accessible in text-based sources in the same way. And so in audio narratives, sound, voice, music, and effects are all integral parts in being able to convey information to audiences through the act of storytelling. So next up is the use of the subjective narrator. So in textbooks and guidebooks, there is an authoritative, invisible voice, but not a known narrator. So what I found in the National Trust guidebooks, and researchers have also found this in travel guidebooks as well, is that the language used in these types of textbooks are authoritative. They tell audiences where to look, what monuments to see, foods to eat, what traditions are important, and they paint a specific picture of the people and places that they're writing about. But that cannot always be accurate, and in turn can sometimes exoticize these locations and their culture. So the invisibility of the author only obscures the fact that guidebooks are subjective and often come with a specific agenda. So in nonfiction biographies and travelogues, audiences are prepared for a bias and more personal account of the writer's journey, making them aware that the account could be skewed or inaccurate, whereas guidebooks have a tone of authority that masks such biases. So as a result, Robert Folk argues that guidebooks are manufactured rather than written, compiled rather than edited, designed and packaged for mass distribution rather than reviewed and evaluated. So while completely getting rid of personal biases when telling stories isn't possible, and neither is achieving complete authenticity with audiences, hosts of narrative podcasts can provide a sense of connection and authenticity by making their voices known. So for more didactic text like guidebooks, there can be dozens of writers and editors, but kind of no definable person to attach views to statements made in the text. So while there is an authoritative voice, there's no way to kind of build trust or intimacy with audiences, and it's harder for audiences to challenge or disagree with what is written, should they wish to do so. So building intimacy with audiences is a key theme throughout podcast research. The heart of narrative podcasts is through storytelling by subjective narrators. So since the growth of podcasts in the mid 2000s, podcasting has been known as a platform of digital intimacy, where first-person singular subjective storytellers tell personal stories. They share their thoughts and emotions, and they share narratives beyond a traditional pedagogical manner, which listeners expect from podcast hosts. In narrative podcasts, while the hosts primarily speak through a more scripted format, as opposed to the conversational podcasts that many comedians use, the host of narrative podcasts provide a sense of authenticity by also talking about personal aspects of their own lives. So in Serial, the host, Sarah Koenig, built up intimacy with her listeners, not because she was the authority or the sole writer of the written text she performs, but as a part of the audio narrative. So becoming author, narrator, interviewer, and character. So Sarah Koenig's emotions about the stories and the evidence that she discovers are on full display throughout the podcast. So the host's emotions further aid the storytelling aspects of the podcast, creating an intimate storytelling experience for listeners. So this shift in objective journalism to personal storytelling by a subjective first-person narrator is now being valued by listeners as highly as consuming the content of the news. So by pivoting away from traditional objective news journalism and embracing narrators with subjective views and emotions, podcasts can build a humanistic intimacy with listeners and can establish their trust. In Pod Lady at Penryn, I shared personal stories about my own life, and I shared my own personal emotions when I was learning about distressing subjects like industrial strikes and transatlantic slavery. I don't claim to be an expert throughout the podcast, nor am I an invisible authoritative narrator distancing my words from my feelings. I present myself as a person with views and emotions and complications like every other human being. And while it's impossible for me to be completely neutral on Penryn's story, at least I'm not invisible. So I give my audience the choice to judge whether they agree with what I say, whether what the speakers and the contributors say, whether they believe in that or agree or disagree with that. And so in Pod Lady and Penryn, I'm an explorer and a facilitator of other speakers' words whilst building that connection with my audience. So the next layer of the narrative podcast is music and sounds. Sound can provide an immersive experience of listening for audiences, which can evoke a place and bring about bonding emotions to that place, such as positive, distressing, and confusing emotions. So the immersive nature of using sounds and music in narrative podcasts means that scenes can be made to seem quicker or slower, inserting a sense of time passing while also conveying meaning behind the sound. So, for instance, in the first episode of Pod Lady at Penryn, I explore stories connected with Penryn's medieval history, and so throughout the episode, there is kind of this medieval-esque music and sound that I use to establish a sense of place in medieval Wales. I use specific instruments such as drums, acoustic guitars, and wind instruments that are commonly used in other medieval-centric media to highlight this medieval setting that I'm trying to tell audiences about. So in one part of the episode, I talk about there being a raid on Penryn Castle in order to steal important legal documents pertaining to the rightful ownership of the estate. So that story came from interviews from experts on these events and legal documents in the Penryn collections at the archives at Bangor University. And rather than just kind of presenting these events as in a factual manner, I include music that listeners would recognize as synonymous with that time period, and in a tone that evoked a sense of danger for the scene I was trying to create, in order to aid in telling those historical facts about the raid on Penrhyn Castle. So the immersiveness of creating these scenes through sounds puts listeners into the story and allows the listeners to use their imagination to explore characters and events as exciting parts of the story and not just as historical facts. So likewise, ambient sounds can also aid in creating a sense of place and meaning to audiences. In a geographical-based podcast, Cork is the Lee, podcaster and researcher Richard Scriven created his own podcast to look at the ways that sound could create a sense of place around the River Lee in Cork in Ireland. And what he found was that by recording the diegetic ambient sounds of the area or recording the river itself, it helped convey a sense of place connected to the river. And listeners could use their imagination to put themselves into the location of the story. So it sounds like water, like those recorded for the Cork is the Lee podcast, gave a voice to the river and communicates to listeners its contemporary and historical and geographical presence in the area. So on page, readers can read about the existence of the river, but in the podcast, listeners can actually hear it, and it can become a presence in the story as well. So in episode 4 of Pod Lady at Penrhyn, I focused on the slate industry in North Wales because the Penrhyn estate was a big part of the slate landscape in the 19th century. And for that episode, I included the diegetic audio of slate being split by a quarryman and a demonstrator who had given me a presentation on slate work at the National Slate Museum in Clanberis. And if you've ever heard slate splitting or you've walked over slate, it's got this very kind of crunchy, unique sound to it that's hard for me to explain in words now. So, but to me, it's such a defining sound to the Aruri landscape that I wanted to make sure that I included it in the podcast. I wanted slate to be an integral part of Penrhyn's story, where listeners could not only hear about slate in North Wales, but hear the slate itself, experience the sound for themselves without physically being there. So this opens the door for listeners to kind of transport themselves mentally to the quarry, maybe visualize the quarrymen working in the slate beds. When I compared that to the National Trust guidebooks, they referenced the quarry and kind of stories connected to how the quarry became popular, but it couldn't provide that sense of place and an immersive experience of sound like the narrative podcast could. So lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is the layer of multivocality and the use of voice and narrative podcasts. So on a general level, the oral nature of podcasting can reveal an array of emotions, speech patterns, diverse accents and vernacular, cultural backgrounds and life experiences of the speakers through listening to their voices. The voice is an effective means of reaching an audience as it's expressive and can reveal emotions like happiness, anger, fear, confidence, and sadness, which makes the listener realize that the stories that they're listening to are lived experiences. So the narrative podcast uses a mixture of a subjective host, expert voices on the topic at hand, and then personal stories of interviewees. So by using multivocality, so i.e. a multiplicity of voices, listeners are exposed to different accents, tones and intonation in voices, all signaling to listeners that they are listening to fellow human beings with complex experiences and emotions, just like they would be. So this multiplicity can mean either a multiplicity of voices or narratives, showing a multitude of life experiences, perspectives, and expertise. So using Podlady Penryn as an example again, unlike the singular authoritative voice of the guidebook, stories of Penryn's early history, its connection with slavery, stories of Penryn Castle, the local culture of slate quarrying, can all flow into one story as each of these voices is featured throughout the 5 episodes. So the format of the podcast allows for these flow of voices to be very interwoven. It doesn't have to just be my voice or just the expert's point of view or just personal stories. They're all packaged as a part of Penryn's story, and all is important as each other in order to tell these multi-layered stories. So multivocality is also a great way to be able to bring in diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. So in the heritage industry, podcasts like Podlady Penryn can use multivocality for subjects such as slavery to reorient views about landed estates, to expand beyond the ties of implied imperialism and colonialism. So the informal and intimate nature of podcasts help promote marginalized narratives and can shape how heritage sites are seen. So not just through the lens of British history, but as global sites connected to marginalized narratives in places like Jamaica. So through the use of multivocality in Podlady Penryn, I attempted to reorient Penryn's identity from aspects that are just synonymous with the typical British country house to that of a Welsh estate with multiple locations, time periods, people, and narratives. So whilst the story of the Pennant family, so the family that owned the estate, and their home are not abandoned by the podcast, they're not the dominant narrative. They are, as in life, a single piece of the estate's story. So instead, the focal point for Penryn's story is the multiplicity of narratives and voices involved inside and outside of the country house, both locally and globally. So the use of multivocality in narrative podcasts is a great way to make topics that have been viewed as traditionally academic accessible, personal, and exciting to broad audiences. So now that we've explored the layers of the narrative podcast, how is this type of podcast useful in, say, academic spaces? How can audio storytelling be used outside of entertainment in fields such as history, business, studies, and science? So developing a relatable, entertaining narrative around a topic is key for audiences to be able to feel connected to the information that you're conveying. So one of the key things that a narrative style podcast does is present fact as fiction. So as podcast theorist Mia Lindgren says, narrative style podcasts use the techniques of fiction to news production to give the setting, human subjects, and topics addressed in a news story a heightened sense of drama, emotion, or entertainment value that make it more compelling to listeners. So though these podcasts are factual, they're packaged as fiction in order to engage the listener and create a sense of interrelatedness that fiction can bring to readers. So psychologists have found that narrative intelligence is vital to human cognition as it aids humans in making sense of the world around them, and learning through storytelling helps form understanding of and ascribe meaning to the human experience. So this type of communication can be a really powerful way of conveying information. So studies have shown that the brain tends to be more skeptical and quizzical when information is presented as factual and informative compared to when it's presented as a story, which tends to lower the listener's intellectual guard and allow humans to connect more with their emotional thinking. So utilizing storytelling is a great way to bring a sense of intimacy to a specific sphere in a way that makes the topics covered not seem intimidating foreign or out of depth to an array of audiences with different experiences and expertise. So podcast researchers have found that some listeners have been put off by academically focused podcasts where hosts use jargon phrases that are more industry specific than for the entertainment of the listeners. So some academics have been found to deliver podcasts in the same way they might present a conference paper, which can mean that a broad audience could be put off by the podcast or confused. In the past, more traditional style radio shows, such as NPR, were synonymous with educated or even elite audiences, appearing less accessible for groups who didn't fall in those categories. So many hosts have been looking at ways of creating podcasts that are more intimate, conversational, or storytelling in nature in order to be accessible to broad audiences. So, for example, conversational style storytelling podcasts allow for historians to think outside the box in terms of how they present history and then how they present themselves. So making history feel more accessible, both for those who are familiar with their expertise and those who are not as exposed to academia or, say, the heritage industry. As examples, the National Trust and English Heritage in the past have had YouTubers and comedians as hosts of storytelling podcasts who interview historians, archaeologists, and conservationists, all while bringing together personal aspects of their life to the podcast and sharing historical stories through well-crafted music and sounds. So another example is Historians on Housewives, which is a podcast that connects historical events to scenes in the reality television franchise, The Real Housewives. So the hosts, who are all historians, interview other historians on subjects such as race, power, slavery, medieval history, and domestic violence, interspersed with stories of the Real Housewives. So the hosts decided on that format for their podcast in order to reach possibly a new audience through focusing on an area of society that is current and relevant, but which also allows the host to explore aspects of history through that lens. So the hosts could reorient themselves as people who enjoy current entertainment and reality TV, just like the rest of us, rather than being seen as simply experts in maybe clips of a documentary. So the host could explore academic subjects and bring on experts to their podcast and still maintain a conversational and relatable format that does not limit audiences based on their educational level. So all this to say, by creating stories around topics, utilizing a personal subjective host, prioritizing a multiplicity of voices and perspectives, and using layers such as music and sounds, narrative podcasts can be a powerful way to reach audiences without diminishing the importance of learning and research. Thank you very much.